This is my 88 Ranger project. I just kind of got started on it. It's going to be a beamed link truck, pretty much the exact, very similar to that thing. That was the very first truck kind of anything like this that I'd ever built other than a simple lift kit. And I've gotten kind of asked quite often if I was going to build that truck again, what would I do differently? Something I think about a lot. And so I'm kind of at a point here we're at. This is what I would do differently. And decided I'm going to try to document some of this stuff. It's going to be a slow process. It took me 3 years to build, when I started building that truck till when I started driving it. And you know, I'm not rich by any means, so this very well could take that long, if not longer. But that should give me plenty of time to go over some of this stuff and kind of show what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and some of the differences versus that truck. So kind of covering it. This is a 68 truck. It was on a 70s frame, a two-wheel drive frame. Very first thing I would have done differently is I would have ditched the factory frame. I did cut it off at the back to make room and back half it. But if I was starting this over, I would ditch the floor, I would ditch the frame, I would just use the cab and the skins of it. Partly now this floor is, you know, it's 1968, it's super in nice condition. I kind of wanted to keep it. I'm kind of glad I did. But progressing to this truck, I bought this truck for $500 for this Ranger. I already had this tube work laid out. It's laid out pretty nice. The ceiling's dynamatted. I wish this bar was maybe a little bit further up tighter. Not the end of the world. They do have the head clearance in here. Some of the welds maybe need a little cleaned up. But the biggest thing was having not factory frame rails. It's got 2x4 rectangular tube frame rails. That's exactly what I wish I would have done on that. That was a C-channel frame. I ended up cutting with a 4.5-inch grinder every piece of plate all the way back to box those in and make those boxed rails. I've got probably a month into that. That's all I did for a month. With a cutoff wheel, cutting out a plate. I don't have the most resources in here. I have a TIG welder, Harbor Freight. I have a Harbor Freight tube notcher. And I cut all my plate out with a portaband and a cutoff wheel, flap wheel, DA sander. Everything plate is made with that. So that whole entire truck, everything plate on it, other than the beams, was made with a cutoff wheel. Those trailing arms were all made. And so that's one of those differences too. I was trying to save money. I invested a lot of my time into making those and cutting with a cutoff wheel. This truck, I'm gonna use more CAD to get stuff done. Plasma tables, a lot of the plate work is gonna end up getting drawn. Pay the money to just get the nice plasma work done. And when it comes to welding, all that stuff is just so much nicer. So for these beams are gonna be tube interstructured. It's very simple to do in a garage. I've been using a cutoff wheel to make all these cuts and my tube notcher for the notching. These spindles are spindles that I had. They're old spindles off of that truck. I've remade and made new spindles for that truck. These are not necessarily perfect. There are some flaws with them. But for the cost and the time to build and redesign new ones, I'm okay with the flaws that these have for what it's going to mean for the drivability of the truck. They're the same flaws that that truck has had forever. And I don't think it's for the savings and the strength that this is. And if you're asking, some of it is how this is a horizontal joint. I would much rather prefer I should say this is a vertical joint. I would much rather prefer a horizontal joint on the top and bottom. The steering on this style is limited by the joint itself. When this stops in here, it does not turn anymore. If you have a horizontal design, you have full 360 rotation. So that is not your limiting factor on the steering. Now it just takes a little bit more design. And like I said, I've already got these spindles. Some of this build is about utilizing, pretty much stock components, cheap things, trying to build as cheap as possible. This is just a 2-stall garage with some basic stuff. It's going to have factory Ford 9-inch with a simple rough stuff truss. Link mounts cut out of plate. everything that truck has. Very simple. Strong, it should work. Some of the changes that I've made versus that as far as the actual beams and the layout, some people have been asking about how do you figure out offset? How do you, mount the beam pivots? So this is actually the wheel center line that I have found. I found that with some plumb bobs and leveling the frame out, taking measurements, finding where I want my wheel to be on this thing for overall wheelbase. Once I established that, the separation I wanted for the beam pivots on this truck was 7 inches. That truck is 8 inches. These are going to be a little bit narrower, and I'm going to be able to tuck everything in a little bit tighter. I'm going to try to make a little bit more room when it comes to shock mounting. I'm trying to save myself some room there in shock mounting. You need things to clearance, and you are going to have other things in here, steering. Things do get tight, but so I've got this mount set at 3.5 inches back from center line. This mount is 3.5 inches back this way from center mount, and you can see with the mounted angle, that allows the spindles to be centered in the wheel well. So how you kind of establish which way they kick, because you can kind of notice they both follow the same angle. So this beam pivot is forward and it kicks back, that beam pivot is back and the wheel kicks forward. That really just kind of establishes your swingers for your steering are going to be the same way. They're going to be offsetted the same amount for the steering. So because you can see on this truck right here, that gearbox, they're generally tilted backwards to make more room for the side the gearbox is on, because you need to have your gearbox and your steering coming in there. So you can see on this truck, the way I have these pointing in this back direction, angling, it's actually going to allow this steering swinger to be further back on this frame rail. I'm actually going to be mounting the steering box on the inside of this frame rail here. So that is how and why I've picked those beams to go back at that position. Those are kind of some of the questions so far that I've gotten. If you got any more, I'm currently I'm working on designing and drawing up some swinger brackets, the swingers themselves, the radius arms, radius mount. Those are all things that are kind of next on the list as I progress. Once I get this full cycling steering and beam suspension, I'll be then working on plating it all in. So there'll be several stages of this. There still may be some tweaking. Right now this is all set up to get as much bump travel as possible from ride height. And that is kind of the main idea. So as I plate these in, distance will close a little bit, and I'll have to do some cycling at the wheel. But I'm looking for at least minimum of 10 inches of bump travel, if not more. I'm going to try to maybe get more, about 12. And if I have to, I may even cut into this frame rail and notch out on both sides for the beam to tuck into up higher to get a lower ground clearance at bump, and just to get more bump travel from ride height. So those are some of the things that on that truck had been changed over time. Always trying to achieve it. Didn't have enough bump travel in the first rendition of it, and it still could use a little more, but I'm at the limitations with that factory frame. So with this truck, starting fresh and starting new, I've got myself plenty of clearance for the bump travel that I'm wanting. Another difference, what would you do differently? The blue truck, very first thing I did is mounted the motor, mounted the trans, and pretty much stuck to my positioning from day one on those. I never moved them. Looking back on it, and obviously I'm doing it different now, I'm going to build all the suspension first. There's no engine cage on this. I built the engine cage around that motor before the suspension was ever there. Those are things I would not do. So now this suspension is getting fully built and cycled exactly how I want, with nothing in here. Once the suspension's cycling how I want, I'm going to end up getting a motor in here, a trans in here, getting those mounted, cutting the firewall out, and at that point, then I'll start caging the front and working around shock mounts, where I want the shocks. There's a lot of things that I ran into. Having this engine and cage in here first, some of these bars got cut out, moved 2-3 times. A lot of stuff kind of redone, but that is kind of the process of doing it the first time. You don't really know. You're kind of just at certain stages. You have to just do things. And now on this one, having some of the foresight to look ahead, this is how I would prefer to start building this truck, is building all the suspension first.